I kept my eyes on my boots because that was what Philip told me to do. The west stairwell at Copper Line was all raw concrete and cold air by then, sometime after 1 a.m., and every step I took came back at me a half-second late. I remember the sound of my own breathing more than anything. That and the radio clipped to my belt, quiet for once, like it was waiting on something. The shadow still slipped into the edge of my vision anyway. I didn't look up. I knew better by then, but I could see enough to know it wasn't lining up with the light. It moved wrong, not fast, not slow either, just wrong. That was when I understood he hadn't made those rules up for me. To tell it right, I have to start back at the beginning of the night. I got to Copper Line a little before 9 p.m. The sun had been down for a while, but Phoenix still held on to heat in the roads and the block walls. By the time I turned off the wider street and headed up toward the north edge of downtown, that heat had started bleeding off. The city was still out there, just not where I was. You could see the brighter part of it a few blocks away, down closer to Roosevelt Row, where the lights sat higher and steadier. Up by Grand Avenue, things started breaking apart. Old warehouse walls, chain-link lots, half-cleared ground, new buildings going up beside stuff that looked like it had been empty 10 years. Copper Line sat a few blocks outside the bright part of downtown Phoenix where the city stopped looking finished. The site took up most of the block. 8 stories of poured concrete, framing, exposed openings, and work lights clipped to places that made the whole thing look flatter than it was. The banner on the fence showed the finished rendering, all glass and warm lights and clean balconies. The real thing behind it looked like somebody had stopped in the middle and never come back. I parked outside the chain link and killed the engine. For a second, I just sat there with both hands on the wheel. I'd taken worse jobs than that one. I just hadn't managed to keep them. That was the part I was sick of, not the work, not even the night shifts. It was the look people got after a while, when they stopped asking how the new job was going and started waiting to hear how long I'd lasted. Nobody ever said it straight. They didn't have to. Parker Doss hadn't said it straight either when he told me about the opening. He just said they needed somebody for nights at a construction site and that most guys didn't stick. He said it like a joke. I heard the rest of it anyway. So I sat there another few seconds and told myself I wasn't doing that again. I wasn't going to be the guy who found a reason to leave before anything had the chance to get hard. It was a dumb thing to be stubborn about, but it was what I had. The air outside had gone dry and thin by then. Not cold yet, not really, but the kind of desert night where you can feel the heat dropping out from under you. The site was darker than it should have been. Downtown was still glowing in the distance, but inside the fence line, it was mostly hard shadows and pale concrete. A couple of lights were on near the trailer and the front side of the building. Everything past that fell off fast. Philip was waiting near the trailer with one hand in the pocket of his jacket. He wasn't imposing, just older, lean, worn down in a way that didn't look soft on him. The first thing I noticed was that he kept looking past the fence, not out toward the road, but in toward the building itself. "You Miles?" Philip said. "Yeah," I said. He looked past me at the building. "Keep up and don't freelance," he said. That was it for the introduction. He walked me toward the trailer and opened the door like he'd done it 1,000 times. Inside, it smelled like old coffee, dust, and paper that had sat too long in dry air. There was a folding table, a couple of metal chairs, a half-dead monitor setup, and a wall calendar that hadn't been turned over yet. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looked staged. That helped for maybe 2 seconds. Then he handed me the radio like it weighed more than it should have. It was just a site radio. Black plastic, scratched near the clip, one strip of faded tape on the side where somebody had probably labeled it once. Still, the way he passed it over made me check it before I even clipped it on. Same with the ring of keys, same with the logbook. He didn't explain any of that. He didn't need to. It was the kind of care people use when they're handing you something they expect you to bring back. I signed where he told me to sign and flipped through the earlier pages while he watched. Patrol times, notes about fencing, a delivery issue, a side gate that had stuck the week before, normal stuff. Or normal enough. I remember that bothering me too. If the place had looked wrong from the jump, I might have trusted my own nerves more. But everything I could point to had a plain explanation. Nothing about Philip sounded theatrical. That was what bothered me. He didn't try to scare me. He didn't smirk. He didn't have that half-amused tone older guys get when they're messing with the new guy. He just moved with the steady patience of somebody who expected to be taken seriously. Every now and then, his eyes drifted back toward the building, toward the dark cut of it against the weaker sky. And every time they did, I got the feeling he was tracking something I couldn't see yet. That was how the night started. Quiet, dry, normal enough to keep me there. Just wrong enough that I remember it better than I should. Philip walked me through the site right after that, not in any grand tour kind of way. He just took me where I'd need to go and told me what mattered. The front gate, the trailer, the fence line, the side access points, the temporary lighting, the contractor parking area outside the fence, the material bay on the first floor, the stairwells, the open floors above. He moved like a man who'd done the same route too many times to waste words on it. The gate was the easy part. Keep it secured. Don't let anybody talk their way back in once the site was shut down. The trailer was where the logbook stayed, along with the backup flashlight, spare batteries, the dead monitor nobody had replaced, and a cheap coffee maker that looked older than I was. The rounds were simple on paper. Start at the front, walk the perimeter, check the west side fence, circle back in, make your way through the lower floor access, then work your way up what was open and authorized. Log the time every round. Log anything that looked off. Don't improvise. Don't play foreman. Don't touch equipment that wasn't yours. Don't assume a door was supposed to be open just because it had been open once already. Philip pointed things out without wasting words. The site was big enough to feel different depending on where you stood. From the front gate, it looked like a normal mid-rise build. 8 floors, raw concrete frame, exposed openings where windows would go, temporary lights on the lower levels, and stacks of materials still sitting in organized rows where the day crews had left them. Once you got inside the fence, it changed. From the outside, it still looked like a building. Inside, it felt like too many parts of it weren't agreeing yet. The west perimeter ran along the darker side of the property, where the neighboring lots were mostly chain link, broken asphalt, and one long warehouse wall with no windows facing us. That side mattered because it gave people cover. It also got less spill from the streetlights, so the fence checks had to be real checks, not just a glance. He told me to put a hand on the chain links in a couple places, make sure tension hadn't changed. Look for ties cut low where a lazy person might miss them. Look for sections pressed in and springing back. I liked that kind of detail, honestly. It made the job sound like something you could do right if you paid attention. The first floor had the trailer access, a rough future lobby space, a couple of framed-out utility rooms, and the material storage area where they'd stack drywall, steel studs, conduit, buckets, wrapped pallets, and whatever else the day crews needed the next morning. Nothing in there was random. That was one of the first things I noticed. Even mess had a pattern to it. Stuff got left out, sure, but it was left where somebody expected to come back to it. Above that, the unfinished floors were mostly repetition. Long, half-formed hallways, unit frames, wiring, exposed openings, temporary rails, and enough similar corners to make a tired man feel like he was walking the same stretch twice. There were 2 stairwells, east and west. He pointed them both out, but the west one got a little more of his attention, though not enough yet for me to call it strange. At that point, it just looked like another concrete stairwell. Dust on the treads, cold handrail, sound that didn't die when it should. The 8th floor was the top of the active build. Beyond that was mechanical access, roof work, and areas I wasn't supposed to be treating like part of a normal round. Philip didn't pitch that like mystery. He pitched it like boundary. You only go where the job says you go. Most of it's just walking and writing things down, Philip said. That all? I asked. If it was all that, they wouldn't keep losing people, Philip said. That sat with me longer than I wanted it to. I'd heard versions of that line before, in other jobs. Not those exact words, but close enough. Usually it meant the work sucked, or management sucked, or the schedule did, or the pay wasn't enough to keep people from disappearing after a week. I told myself that was all this was. A lonely overnight site, a weird part of town after dark, an older guy who'd been at it too long and had seen enough flaky hires come and go to stop softening anything. That should have been enough explanation for me. Most of the time, I'm good at grabbing the explanation that lets me keep moving. I had a history of leaving before things got hard enough to expose me. That was the truth of it. Not some big collapse, not one life-changing disaster, just a line of jobs I never held long enough to let settle into something solid. Warehouse work, deliveries, maintenance help, a gate post out by a storage lot for a while. Every time I had a reason. Schedule sucked, manager was an ass, pay wasn't worth it. The hours messed with my sleep, the drive was too far. Some of that was true. Enough of it was true to keep me from feeling like a liar, but the pattern was still there. People never said it like that out loud, but I knew what they meant. You get tired of hearing surprise in somebody's voice when you tell them you're still somewhere. You get tired of people saying things like, "Let's see if this one sticks," and pretending they're joking. You get even more tired of realizing they're not wrong. So yeah, I needed the money. But I could have needed the money at some easier place. I took Copperline because Parker had said most guys didn't last, and I was sick of hearing that in one form or another. I wanted one job where I didn't fold early and tell myself I had a good reason. That was what I brought with me through the gate that night, whether I wanted to admit it or not. We kept walking. Philip showed me where the temporary light switches were on the lower level, which doors should stay latched, which ones swelled in the frame and needed an extra shove, which parts of the fence line picked up trash when the wind shifted. Nothing fancy. Real site stuff. The kind of details that make a place feel owned by the people working in it. He never once called the place creepy. He didn't need to. By then the crews were gone. There might have been somebody wrapping up late less than an hour before I got there, maybe even close to 8:30 p.m. if they'd been trying to finish something for the next morning. But there was no night shift. No reason for fresh noise, no reason for moving lights, no reason for anybody above us. And still, now and then, I'd stop without meaning to and listen. The site still felt normal then. It just didn't feel empty. That was the part I noticed before anything else really started. Not a sound exactly. More like the silence had layers to it. Street noise from far off, wind passing through openings in the concrete, a loose sheet of plastic somewhere ticking against itself. Then, under all that, something I couldn't have named yet. Not movement, not work, just the feeling that the place hadn't settled all the way after everybody left. We ended up back in the trailer for a minute because Philip wanted me to see how he handled the book before he handed the whole night over. He flipped it open on the metal table, ran one finger down the last entry, then capped his pen and slid it across to my side. The light in there was bad in the usual way. Too white, too flat. It made the dust on everything stand out. The coffee in the pot had probably been sitting since late afternoon, and the place had that dry paper smell old job trailers always get after a long day. He tapped the logbook once. "Gate stays chained after 10, Philip said. He flipped the page with his thumb. "Write every round down. Don't skip the west side." That all tracked. Normal site stuff. The kind of rules you got on any overnight post if the person training you wasn't lazy. I nodded like I was already with him, because I was. I didn't have any problem with gate procedures. I didn't have any problem with paperwork either. In a way, I liked it. A book with times in it meant there was still a right way to do the job, even if nobody was standing over you while you did it. Philip closed the logbook and looked at me for a second. Not long. Just enough to make it clear we were done with the easy part. 2, you can screw up and I might let it go if you got some sense. He let that sit there. The last 5, no. Those are what get you out of here when the sun comes up. So don't do anything stupid. He didn't say any of it with a grin. No pause for effect. No little half laugh to let me know this was old guy mess with the new hire nonsense. He said it the same way he'd told me which door liked to stick in its frame and which stretch of fence picked up trash in the wind. Flat. Practical. Like the difference was not in whether the rules were real, but in how much trouble you got into if you forgot them. That was the point where the job stopped sounding like a job. I followed him out of the trailer because he was already moving. He cut across the lower floor toward the west side, boots scraping through dust and grit, flashlight hanging loose in one hand but never turned on. There was enough light leaking in from the sight lamps outside and the temporary fixtures near the front to see by, though not by much. You had to let your eyes settle in. The farther we got from the trailer, the colder the air felt. Not colder outside. Colder off the concrete. We stopped near the foot of the west stairwell. He kept his eyes on the west stairwell. That was where he gave me the first of the 5. After 1 a.m., he said, if I didn't need that stairwell, I stayed out of it. If I had to use it, I kept my eyes on my boots and nowhere else. No looking through the openings, no checking landings above or below, no glancing out through the side gaps like some idiot trying to see the skyline. Just my feet, one step at a time until I was out again. It sounded stupid in a very specific way, and that made it harder to laugh off. Not crazy, not dramatic, just too exact. I tried to make a normal explanation out of it right away. He didn't want me getting distracted in a partially enclosed stairwell at night. He didn't want me missing my footing. He didn't want me working myself up because every sound in there echoed. Then he added that if I saw a shadow slip into the edge of my vision anyway, I kept moving. I didn't stop. I didn't look up. I didn't ask who was there, and I didn't do anything to let whatever I thought I saw know I'd noticed it. That was the first moment I really felt my shoulders tighten. I still didn't think he was talking about anything impossible. Not exactly. My brain reached for all the normal things first. Somebody getting in through the fence, some half-hidden worker too messed up to have gone home, a transient cutting through where he shouldn't be, even bad lighting, especially bad lighting. But he was giving it to me like a rule, not a possibility. That was the part that stuck. You serious? I asked. Serious enough to still be here, Philip said. He didn't lower his voice when he got to the last 5. That made it worse. He moved again before I could say anything else, and I followed him toward the material area on the lower floor. The place looked ordinary enough under the weak overhead bulbs, bundled studs, stacked drywall, coils of conduit, wrapped pallets, a leaning ladder. Nothing in there looked staged, which only helped the feeling in my gut for a second, before it made it worse again. That was where he told me the next 2. If I found a work light still burning in a section the day log showed as cleared out before the crews left, I wasn't to touch it, not to move it, not to pick it up, not to kill the switch and save them the power. I left it exactly where it was and walked away from it. Then he told me that if I was ever in the material bay and the radio came alive with his voice asking if I was in there, I didn't answer from inside. I got out first. Then I keyed up and answered from the open floor. He gave me no reason for either one. That was what kept pushing it past normal. If he'd said crews forgot gear all the time and management didn't want guards handling contractor equipment, I could have filed the light away with everything else. If he'd said the stacked metal in the material bay bounced radio signals around and garbled transmissions, that would have been enough too. But he didn't. He just gave me the rule and kept walking. We made our way back toward the east side and then up far enough for him to point out where my round stopped. The 8th floor was the top of what counted as my normal route. Above that, if I ever opened onto something that looked too finished, too closed in, too complete for the state the rest of the building was in, I shut the door and backed out of it. I didn't stand there staring. I didn't go in to make sense of it. I treated that as a warning and left. That one sat in my head wrong right away. It still sounds wrong now. I didn't believe him, not all the way. I just didn't like how easy it was to remember every word. We ended up back near the trailer after that. He checked his watch, looked over the front stretch of fence, then back at the building again. Same look as before. Not curiosity, not nerves. More like the kind of attention you give something that has rules of its own, whether you respect them or not. He handed the rest of the shift over without saying much more. No story about the guy before me, no explanation about why people didn't last, no big warning speech. Just the keys, the radio already clipped on my belt, the logbook waiting for the first real entry in my handwriting. Then, he left me there with all 7 rules sitting in my head, the ordinary 2 mixed in with the other 5 like they belonged together. By the time he left, the whole site felt different. Once Philip's truck lights were gone, the site got bigger. That was the first thing I noticed doing the rounds alone. Not quieter exactly, bigger. Like the building had been holding itself in while somebody else was still there to look at it. Once it was just me, the open floors and dark cuts between walls started feeling farther apart than they should have. I clipped the radio on, took the flashlight, checked the front gate again, even though I'd already seen him check it, and wrote my first time in the book with a hand that looked steadier than it felt. Then I started walking. That helped, or it almost helped. The routine part of the job was real enough to lean on. Front fence, side access, lower level. Material area from the outside first. Check the doors, check the latch points, check the temporary lights that were supposed to stay on. Listen for anything that sounded like somebody still inside the fence. Keep moving. Write it down. I could do that. I'd had jobs where you got through the shift by shrinking everything down to the next small task in front of you. One more stop. One more note. One more lap. That kind of work made sense to me. I found myself settling into that without meaning to. I checked the chain on the gate. I checked the trailer door. I walked the outer stretch toward the west side and put a hand on the fence where Philip said to. It was still taut. No cuts I could see, no fresh give in it. I came back around and made another note in the log. Time, gate secure, west perimeter clear, lower level access normal. Reading my own handwriting in that book made the whole thing feel more regular than it was. That was probably why the first wrong thing hit as hard as it did. It was on the lower floor, off one of the side sections where the day crews had been framing and running conduit. I knew from the log that area had been cleared before they left. Philip had shown me the line himself, no crew staying late, no electrician signed in after the others, no note about work carrying over into the night. It was supposed to be dead space until morning, but there was a work light still on. Not just on, set. That was the part that stopped me. It sat low on the concrete, one of those portable stand lights contractors drag from place to place, and it was aimed into a framed-out section of wall at an angle that made the whole thing look halfway active. Light on the studs, light on the exposed wiring, light on a bucket and a tape measure lying near the edge of the spill. Like somebody had stepped away for 30 seconds and meant to come right back. "You've got to be kidding me," I said. No one answered. I didn't move any closer at first. I just stood there and looked at it, trying to make it ordinary by force. The first explanation was easy. Somebody from the late crew left it on. That happened. Guys got tired. They wrapped up quick. They forgot things. A light wasn't a ghost. A light was just bad cleanup. Then I remembered what Philip had said. If I found a work light still burning in a section the day log showed as cleared out, I wasn't supposed to touch it, not move it, not shut it off. Leave it where it was and walk away. I remember feeling irritated before I felt anything else. Irritated at him for planting that in my head. Irritated at myself for stopping because of it. It was a work light. At any other site, I would have shut it off or written it down and moved on. The fact that I was standing there treating it like it meant something made me feel stupid. So I tried to put it back where it belonged. The lower floor still smelled like drywall dust, hot plastic, old coffee from my own breath, and that dry concrete smell buildings get at night when the heat starts finally slipping out of them. Nothing hidden in that, nothing supernatural in a half-framed wall and a forgotten light. The city was still out there past the fence somewhere. Cars moved, air moved, buildings settled, men forgot things. I stood there longer than I should have. Part of me wanted to walk over and shut it off just to prove Philip was full of it, not in some big dramatic way, just because I was already tired of the feeling that I was being handled. I was tired of old men and weird jobs and rules that made me feel like I was one bad reaction away from proving exactly what everybody already thought about me. It would have been easy. 3 steps in, one hand on the frame, bend, switch, done. Instead, I stayed where I was and looked harder. That was when I noticed the cord. It ran back across the floor and disappeared behind a stack of bundled studs. Nothing strange about that by itself, but it wasn't stretched. It wasn't pulled taut like somebody had dragged the light there in a rush and left it. It had been laid clean, curved around the debris, kept out of the main walking path, not neat like a foreman had inspected it, just careful enough that whoever set it there had meant for it to stay there for a while. That was the small thing that got me. A forgotten light is one thing. A placed light is something else. I told myself it wasn't my equipment, and I wasn't getting paid to babysit a contractor's mistakes. That wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that by then I didn't want to be the guy who touched the one thing he'd been specifically told not to touch, then had to spend the rest of the night wondering if anything that came after had started because of him. That was all, or that was close enough to all that I let it stand. I walked away without touching it. I made myself keep the same pace I'd been keeping before I saw it. That part mattered to me for some reason. I didn't want to speed up like I was rattled. I didn't want to look back more than once either. But I did anyway. Just once. The light was still there, still hitting that same half-finished section like somebody had stepped off for a tool belt or a fresh spool of wire and never made it back. Then something else hit me, small and quiet and worse than it should have been. The tape measure lying in the spill of light was open, not all the way, just a little, maybe 10 inches of blade out from the case, the kind of thing you'd see if somebody had set it down in the middle of checking a cut. That wasn't impossible either. None of it was impossible. That was what made it stick under my skin. Every piece of it still had a normal explanation if I took them one at a time. I kept walking and told myself that was all it was. A late crew, sloppy wrap-up, bad handoff, a light left burning, tools left where they didn't belong. The kind of thing the day guys would bitch about in the morning and then forget by lunch. I didn't really believe that. The light looked less like something forgotten and more like something left waiting. I'd been walking the site alone long enough to start talking myself down again. That was one good thing about work with a pattern to it. The longer you kept moving, the easier it got to smooth over whatever had bothered you 10 minutes earlier. I checked the front again, walked the lower level, logged the time, took another pass along the inside fence. I made myself look at ordinary things on purpose: a latch, a stack of drywall, a piece of trash caught low in the chain link, the side of the trailer, my own handwriting in the logbook, anything that belonged to a world where men forgot lights and left tape measures open, and that was all it meant. It almost worked. Then, one of the fire doors on the west side showed open on a lower floor pass when I could have sworn it had been shut before. Not wide open, just enough to be wrong. I stopped in the corridor and stared at the gap for a second. There was a strip of darker black through it where the stairwell sat beyond. No movement, No sound I could point to. Just that thin opening where the latch hadn't caught. There was my work reason. I told myself that part twice before I moved. The point of the rounds was to catch stuff exactly like that. Doors standing wrong. Access points left unsecured. Things that turned into bigger problems if nobody checked them. That was the job. Philip himself would have had to go in there if he'd found the same thing. I wasn't inventing an excuse to spook myself. I was following up on a door that needed to be checked. I still didn't like how long it took me to start walking toward it. The corridor felt colder near that side of the building. Maybe because the concrete held less heat there. Maybe because the openings along the west face let the air move differently. That was the kind of explanation I was still trying to keep alive then. Real explanations. Useful ones. I got to the door and put my hand on the push bar. The metal felt colder than it should have. That was when Philip's voice came back to me clear as if he were standing behind my shoulder. After 1 a.m., if you don't need that stairwell, stay out of it. If you do need it, keep your eyes on your boots and nowhere else. I checked my watch. A little after 1 a.m. I remember almost laughing once under my breath at the timing of it, but even then it didn't come out right. I was too irritated. At the building, at Philip, at myself most of all. I stood at the stairwell door longer than I should have. Then I pushed it open. The air changed first, not in some impossible way, just enough to register. The corridor had felt cold. The stairwell felt empty. That was different. The concrete walls pulled the little sound there was into themselves and then gave some of it back late. My first step landed and came back at me a beat off. Not enough to seem fake, enough to make me notice it. "Just stairs," I said. My voice sounded small in there. That annoyed me enough to make me keep going. I kept my eyes on my boots and started down. Dust on the treads, scuffed toes. A little chalky grit worked into the grooves of the concrete. I locked onto that and held there, because once you commit to something like that, pride starts doing part of the work for you. I wasn't going to be the guy who heard one weird echo and immediately broke the one instruction he'd been given. I'd already had enough jobs where I found out too late that what really did me in was not the work itself, but the second I started thinking I knew better than the people already there. So I watched my steps. The first landing came and went. Then the second. Nothing. Just the scrape of my boots and the faint hiss of air moving somewhere higher up. One hand stayed near the rail, but not on it. I didn't want to hear my skin dragging across painted metal. I didn't want any extra sound in there if I could help it. Then, somewhere between the next turn and the one after that, the stairwell stopped feeling measured. That's the cleanest way I can put it. I wasn't counting out loud. I wasn't doing anything that formal. But you know how a normal stairwell gives you a sense of itself after a couple flights. The rhythm of it. Turn, landing, flight, turn. You stop needing to think about the shape because your body starts learning it. This one had that for a minute, then didn't. The drop beside me felt deeper on one turn than it had on the turn before. The next landing sounded farther away under my feet than it should have. The wind shifted in a way that made me feel like there was a wider opening somewhere off to my left, even though I knew the layout wasn't supposed to be changing underneath me. I kept my eyes on my boots anyway. That was where the irritation started turning into something tighter. I told myself construction sites do that. Raw structures breathe in strange ways. Openings channel air. Concrete throws sound around. You get tired enough, and your balance goes a little stupid in enclosed spaces. There are normal reasons for all kinds of things if you want them badly enough. By the time the shadow slipped into the edge of my vision, I already knew I was past the point where a normal explanation would help. It came in low and sideways at first, not a full shape. More like the suggestion of one, right where my sight blurred out past the edge of my direct focus. A darker movement against dark concrete, human-sized, upright, not crossing in front of me exactly, more like it was moving along with the structure itself, keeping pace in a place that didn't line up with where another set of stairs should have been. Everything in me wanted to stop, not think, not decide, just stop and snap my head toward it the way any normal person would if they thought someone was in the stairwell with them. That was the hard part, not the fear, the effort. The worst part wasn't seeing it. The worst part was how hard I had to work not to react. Rule 4 came back to me all at once. If you catch a shadow slipping into the edge of your vision, keep moving. Don't stop. Don't look. Don't ask who's there. I did the dumbest useful thing I could think of. I picked one scuff mark on the toe of my right boot and kept that in the center of my sight like it was a target. Step, landing, turn, step again. My chest felt too tight all of a sudden. My mouth had gone dry. I was aware of my own shoulders in this awful physical way, like they wanted to rise and lock near my ears. I had to make myself keep them down. The shadow came again, not clearer. That somehow made it worse. 1 second it was just at the edge, cut by the angle of the wall and the weak spill of light from somewhere below. The next second, it seemed slightly higher or farther or on the wrong side of where it should have been for a person moving through the same stairwell as me. If I'd looked right at it, maybe I could have broken it apart, maybe it would have turned into railing and gaps in my own nerves. But I didn't look. I couldn't tell whether that meant I was being smart or already too far inside whatever the hell Philip had been trying to warn me about. I didn't stop. I didn't ask who was there. I got to the next landing and kept going until I hit the corridor door and shoved through it harder than I meant to. The hallway outside felt warmer by almost nothing at all, but it was enough to make me feel the difference. Framing, dust, open studs, weak utility light from farther down the floor, all of it ugly and normal in a way that hit me like relief and embarrassment at the same time. I stood there with one hand still on the door bar, looking straight ahead because I didn't trust myself to look back into the stairwell without making it worse. When I finally did move, I walked down the corridor at a pace I hoped counted as normal. That didn't work either. My body knew before I did that something had happened in there. My breathing was wrong. My legs felt over-careful on flat concrete. I checked a door that didn't need checking just to have something practical to do with my hands, then another one after that. I even wrote in the log before I was fully ready to, because the act of writing the time down steadied me a little. West stairwell door found unlatched, secured, upper floor access normal. I stared at the words after I wrote them. Normal. That was doing a lot of work. When I got out of that stairwell, I was still trying to tell myself I hadn't actually seen anything. That was technically possible. Technically. The building was unfinished. The light was bad. The geometry of those concrete stairs could throw shadows in ways I didn't understand. I'd been primed by Philip's warning, then irritated by it, which maybe was worse. Once somebody tells you exactly what not to see, you get half a shape in the corner of your eye and your own brain rushes in to finish the job. I went with that for a while. I had to, but I didn't feel as good about mocking Philip in my head after that. Before the stairwell, it had been easy to treat the rules like a rough old guard's way of keeping the new guy cautious. Afterward, that got harder. Not impossible, just harder. Because whether I'd seen a man-shaped shadow or just my own nerves breaking apart under bad concrete and bad light, he'd still known enough to tell me exactly what I'd want to do in that moment. And I'd spent that whole walk back out fighting the urge to do it. I went straight back to the trailer and wrote down what I could. West stairwell door found unlatched, secured. That was clean enough. It was also a lie, or close to one. The door had been unlatched. I had secured it, but none of that was the part still stuck in my chest. I capped the pen and looked at the radio on my belt. It hadn't done anything yet. It had just sat there while I talked myself through the stairwell and back out again. That should have made it feel like one solid thing in the middle of all the other uncertainty. A radio was a radio. If somebody keyed up, you answered. If they didn't, you didn't. That was simple. Clean. That was the kind of thing I needed right then. So I forced myself back into the rounds. I checked the front fence again, walked the lower level, looked at the gate chain, looked at the trailer lock, put my hand on the west perimeter fencing where Philip had told me to, and found nothing wrong with it. I even went out of my way to focus on little physical stuff, the kind that keeps your brain from getting too far ahead of you. The grit under my boots, the tug of the flashlight against my jacket pocket, the dry pull in my throat from the dust, the way the night air kept slipping through the open concrete in thin, colder threads now that it was later. It almost steadied me. Then I ended up back near the material bay. I had a reason this time, same as I had with the stairwell. On my last pass from the lower floor corridor, I'd caught a sound from inside that area and kept going, because I was still too wound up from the stairwell to trust myself with it. Nothing loud, just a small metallic tap, then another one after a few seconds. It could have been settling materials. It could have been a loose piece shifting where someone stacked it badly. It could have been nothing. Still, it was part of the job to check. If I started skipping things because my nerves were getting ahead of me, then the whole night was going to break apart fast. The material bay looked different once I stepped inside it, instead of just passing the opening. From the corridor, it had always been one dark section full of stored supplies. Inside it, the place got chopped up. Drywall stacks stood shoulder high in some spots and taller in others. Bundled steel studs leaned in clean rows. Coils of conduit sat near the back wall, silver edges catching what little light reached them. Wrapped pallets cut the floor into lanes that weren't really lanes, just tight strips of walking room between hard shapes. The shadows layered over each other in there. Not deep enough to hide a person outright, but enough to break things apart. Enough that one stack looked like two until you got close, and the gaps between materials felt narrower than they really were. The sound changed too. That was the part I hated right away. Every step I took in there came back deadened, then strangely sharp a second later, off some metal edge or concrete column. If I shifted my shoulders past a stack of studs, the scrape of my jacket sleeve sounded farther away than it should have. A little piece of loose plastic somewhere kept ticking now and then, but I couldn't tell from where. The whole area felt like it took ordinary noise and bent it just enough to make you waste attention on it. I moved slowly, flashlight down, checking that nothing had been dragged out of place or left where it shouldn't have been. I wasn't touching anything, just looking. There was no work light burning in there now, not like before. That should have helped. It didn't. Then I heard it again. Metal, light but clean, like one length of conduit nudging another. I stopped, not frozen, just listening. It came from deeper in the bay, then didn't come again. I told myself if some crew had left something stacked wrong, that was all it was. A shift in temperature, a little settling. Maybe I'd brushed something with my boot without noticing. I kept moving because standing still in that place felt worse than walking. I took 2 more careful steps between a drywall stack and a pallet of wrapped boxes and started angling toward the back side where the sound had seemed to come from. That was when the radio came alive. "Miles, you in there?" Philip said over the radio. I had the radio in my hand before I remembered the rule. That's how fast that happened. No thought, no fear first, just reflex. Somebody says your name in a quiet place and your hand moves before the rest of you catches up. My thumb was already on the side of the radio when Philip's words from earlier caught up to me. If I was ever in the material bay and his voice came over the radio asking if I was in there, I was not supposed to answer from inside. I was supposed to get out first. "Don't," I said. I don't know if I meant it for myself or for whatever had just used his voice. I backed up too quickly at first and caught my heel on something low, maybe a bundle tie or a piece of scrap. Not enough to fall, just enough to make my heart punch harder. I kept the flashlight down, because I didn't want to turn one bad angle into 10 worse ones. The path out that had felt simple coming in now looked broken up and narrower. Drywall to the left, stud bundles to the right. A pallet wrapped in cloudy plastic dead ahead until I shifted 2 feet and found the gap beside it again. The radio stayed quiet. That was almost worse. I got out of the material bay before I keyed in. Once I hit the corridor, the air felt different in the same useless, almost imaginary way the hallway outside the stairwell had. More open, easier to breathe in, even though it probably wasn't. I turned back once, just enough to see the mouth of the material area sitting there dark and ordinary. Then I lifted the radio. "Say again?" I asked over the radio. There was a pause, not long, long enough. Then Philip came back on. "I didn't call you," Philip said. For a second, I didn't know what to do with my face, even though no one was there to see it. I just stood in that half-lit corridor with the radio near my mouth and looked at the opening into the material bay like something might step out if I stared long enough. I didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. He didn't rush to fill the silence either. That was one of the things that got to me later. No quick explanation, no joking tone, no annoyed follow-up asking what I was doing down there if he hadn't called me. Just silence. Then the faint carrier hiss. Finally, I asked where he was. He said he'd been off-site for a while already and was headed home. He asked if I was all right. I said, "Yeah, too fast." He let that sit for a second, then told me to keep the rounds moving and call if something needed to go in the log. Not if something felt off. Not if I got nervous. Something that needed to go in the log. That was as close as he came to saying anything. Then the line went dead. I lowered the radio and stood there another few seconds, listening without meaning to. Somewhere in the building, faint and far enough that I could have pretended it came from outside the fence, I heard something that sounded like work continuing. Not voices, not clear hammering. Just that same ugly half-rhythm construction sites get when somebody is still moving material around after everyone else is done. A drag. A light metallic contact. Then nothing. Up to that point, I could still tell myself the building was wrong in the same way a person gets tired and starts seeing patterns. After that, the site felt aware. That changed the radio too. Permanently. Up until then, the building had still had edges in my head. There was the structure, and then there were the tools I brought into it. My flashlight, my keys, the radio, things that belonged to me for the shift. Things that should have stayed clean no matter what else the night did. Not anymore. Now the radio was just one more thing inside the building's reach. I checked the corridor outside the material bay before I moved on, mostly so I could say I had done it. Everything looked exactly like it should. Dust where there should be dust, materials where they should have been. No footprints I could clearly call fresh, no dropped tools, nothing standing open, nothing visibly wrong. If I'd come on that scene cold with no context, I would have logged nothing and kept going. Instead, I wrote the time, noted the radio check, and left the line below it blank because I couldn't think of a version that made sense. That was a bad feeling too. Different from hearing Philip's voice in there, but not by much. The job had a book for what happened. Gates, doors, fencing, lights. If something happened and there wasn't a real place to put it down, then it didn't belong to the job at all. It belonged to something else, and I was still on the clock inside it. I kept moving because there wasn't anything else to do. But I moved differently after that, more careful with the radio, more aware of where I was standing before I put my hand near it, more aware that the site wasn't just a place anymore. It had started listening back. I went back to the trailer and stood there with one hand on the table like I needed it to hold still for me. The trailer hadn't changed. Same bad coffee smell, same dead monitor, same logbook sitting there with too much white space left in it. But it didn't feel like a work trailer anymore. It felt like the last place on the site still pretending to belong to normal people. I thought about leaving, not in some big dramatic way, just walking out. unclipping the radio, dropping the keys on the table, getting in my truck, and heading back toward the brighter part of the city before I had another reason not to. My body was ready for that option before the rest of me was. My shoulders were tight, my mouth still felt dry. Every time the radio crackled, even just a little, I felt it in my stomach first. I was tired in that ugly early morning way where your thoughts start coming apart around the edges and every choice feels a little louder than it should. I could have left. That was the worst part. Nobody would have had to drag me out. The gate wasn't locked from the inside. My truck was still right where I left it. I could have been on the road in 2 minutes if I wanted to be, and I did want to be. At least part of me did. Then the rest of it caught up. I thought about Parker being right about me. Not because he ever said anything cruel straight to my face. Parker wasn't built that way. But I knew the tone. I knew the little half-smile people got when they handed you a job lead and didn't quite believe you'd still be there a month later. He'd said most guys didn't stick. I'd heard the other half of that sentence on my own. I thought about everybody else being right, too. That came in pieces, which was worse. A warehouse supervisor a couple years earlier looking at the schedule and then at me like he was already adjusting for the fact that I wouldn't be around long. My brother asking how the new job was going with that careful tone people use when they don't want to sound like they're keeping score. One of my mother's friends at a cookout asking if I was still doing deliveries, and when I said no, she just nodded once and said, "Oh." Not mean, not even rude, just familiar with the pattern. That was what stuck. The familiarity of it. I'd spent too many years being the guy who didn't last. I never crashed my life all at once. That almost would have been easier to explain. It was smaller than that. I'd hold on for a while, get tired, get frustrated, start noticing every little thing wrong with the job, then tell myself leaving was the sensible choice. And sometimes it was. A lot of times I had good reasons. But after enough jobs, the reasons didn't matter the way I wanted them to. People stopped hearing the reason. They just heard the result. Gone again. I leaned over the table and looked at the logbook, like it had anything to say back to me. The blank line under the last time entry sat there, waiting for me to fill it with something I could live with. I still didn't know what that would have been. Heard Philip's voice where Philip wasn't. Entered Material Bay. Nothing to report. That almost made me laugh, and the fact that I was close to laughing at all right then made me feel worse. Outside the trailer, the site had gone quieter again. Not empty. I still wouldn't have called it empty, but quieter in a way that made me feel like it was listening to see what I did next. That was where it got personal. The worst thing about that site wasn't what it was showing me. It was how fast it figured out what would keep me there. If all it had been doing was trying to scare me, maybe I would have left. That would have made sense. A bad night, a bad site, something wrong enough that walking out would have felt like common sense. But that wasn't how it landed. It kept pushing right at the one weak place I'd carried in with me. It kept setting things in front of me that turned leaving into something uglier than fear. Leaving would have meant I couldn't handle one night alone on a construction site. Leaving would have meant Parker had read me right the first time. Leaving would have meant all those looks, all those little pauses, all those jokes people didn't think I noticed had been earned. So instead of leaving because I was scared, I got angry at myself for being scared. That felt more familiar, easier to wear. I picked up the pen again, set it down, checked the watch, looked at the radio, looked away from it. I was dragging it out by then, and I knew it. That made me angrier, too. I hated the idea that a place like that could turn me into the kind of man who stood in a trailer burning time because he didn't want to walk back into the dark. "Not like this," I said. My voice sounded rough and stupid in that little room, but it settled something anyway. Not because it was brave, it wasn't. It was stubborn, small, mean even. The kind of decision a man makes when he's more offended than he is wise. I wasn't staying for the paycheck by then. I wasn't staying because I respected the job. I wasn't even staying because I thought I had it under control. I was staying because I could not stand the idea of this place turning into one more entry on the same old list. That was the hook in it. Staying started to feel less like courage and more like a trap I was helping build. I knew that, at least part of the way. I knew I wasn't making the healthy choice. I knew a smarter man might have left the keys, called it in, and let somebody else sort the rest out in daylight. But knowing that didn't help much once my pride got involved. Pride has a way of making bad decisions sound like principles. So I clipped the radio back on, picked up the flashlight, looked once toward the door like I was still giving myself a chance to walk out clean. Then I opened it and stepped back into the site. By then I understood something I hadn't when the night started. The place didn't need to run me down. It just had to keep putting the same thing in front of me and wait for me to do the rest. I don't know exactly what made me go higher. That's the part I still can't clean up into something that sounds smart. I had reasons, or things I called reasons at the time. I wanted a better look from above. I wanted to make one full pass that I couldn't accuse myself of cutting short later. I wanted to prove I still had a handle on the night. All of that was true enough to stand up for a few minutes. Underneath it, there was something uglier. The building had spent hours giving me just enough to keep me from leaving, and by then, I needed to know where it was all pointing. So I worked my way up, not the west stairwell. I stayed clear of that one. I used the other side and kept the flashlight low, checking my footing, checking doors, checking the unfinished corridors that were still ugly in all the normal ways. Raw concrete, open framing. Dust worked into the corners. Temporary light on the lower sections and more darkness the higher I went. On the active floors, the place still looked like a job site. Not a good one, not a comforting one, but a job site. The 8th floor was the top of what counted as normal. That was where Philip had drawn the line earlier without really drawing it. Not as a speech, just a boundary. You only go where the job says you go. If a door ever opened onto something too finished, too closed in, too complete for the rest of the building, shut it and back out. Don't stand there. Don't study it. Don't try to make sense of it. I remembered all of that before I touched the next door. That matters. I'd like to say it opened on its own. It didn't. I pushed it because I was still holding on to the idea that the night had a shape I could understand if I just found the right angle on it. I had that same dumb streak in me that had kept me there in the first place. Not courage, not curiosity either. Something meaner than both. The door gave under my hand, and the air on the other side changed before the view did. Not warmer, not colder, just sealed. That was the first thing that hit me. The unfinished floors all breathed, air moved through them. You felt the city in pieces on those levels, even when it was faint. A draft through an opening, distant traffic bleeding in, dust shifting when you crossed a corridor. The space beyond that door didn't have any of that. It felt contained, finished enough to hold its own air. Then I saw the hallway. The hallway above 8 looked more finished than anything below it. That was what made it wrong. It wasn't some impossible nightmare corridor. That would have been easier, honestly. It looked like exactly what a finished apartment hallway in that building should have looked like if the building had actually been done. Straight walls, clean lines, unit doors set at regular intervals, soft overhead light without the ugly temporary glare the lower floors had. Even the floor under that light looked cleaner, flatter, more complete than any part of the real site had a right to be at that hour. That was what hit me so hard about it. It made sense too fast and too well. It looked like a version of the building that had gotten ahead of itself, not by a week, not by a few late crews staying past 8 p.m. It looked like the place had already been finished and occupied by the logic of its own plans, while the rest of it was still fighting through studs and dust and missing walls below. Everything lined up, but in the wrong order. The hallway looked like the building had finished that part first and left the rest behind. It was just there too soon, and for the wrong reasons. I should have shut the door. I knew that. I stood there anyway. There wasn't anything dramatic happening in front of me. No figure at the far end, no sudden motion, no voice calling my name. That made it worse. The whole thing sat there with the calm confidence of something that didn't need to rush me. The doors were all shut. The light was even. The spacing looked right. That kind of rightness can do more damage than something obviously broken. If a place looks wrong, you back away from it. If it looks right in a way you can't explain, your mind starts trying to help it. Mine did. It started pulling the rest of the night into place whether I wanted it to or not. The work light below hadn't looked forgotten because it wasn't forgotten. It had looked set because it was part of something still in progress. The shadow in the west stairwell hadn't felt like a person using the same space as me, because maybe it wasn't moving through the same version of that space at all. Philip's voice in the material bay hadn't just been some random trick. It had been the site checking where I was, the same way a foreman checks whether a man has made it to the right floor yet. The building wasn't just wrong. It was still working. That thought came into me cold and whole, not like an idea I built, more like the answer to something that had been hanging in the air all night waiting for me to catch up. The lower floors, the materials, the sounds, the light left burning where no one should have been. None of it had felt random. I'd been treating it like separate warnings because that was easier. Standing there looking into that hallway, I couldn't do that anymore. Somewhere deeper in that hall, I heard work still going. It was faint, a soft drag, a light metallic contact, not hammering, not shouting, nothing broad enough to belong to a normal crew. Just small sounds, careful sounds, the kind that would mean almost nothing if you heard them from half a block away outside a real building at 10 a.m. In there, at that hour, on the wrong side of that door, they landed different. Not noisy enough to announce themselves, just steady enough to say somebody or something was still on the job. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I hadn't raised it. I didn't need to. The hall lit itself. That got to me too. The lower floors needed temporary light, clipped light, bad work light, things plugged in and dragged around and forgotten. This place didn't look like it needed any of that. It looked self-contained. That was the word that kept coming back. Self-contained. Self-sure. Like the building had reached ahead of the people building it and made a cleaner version for itself somewhere I wasn't supposed to see. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough to cross the line Philip had drawn. That much I know. Long enough that I stopped thinking about the rest of the site and started thinking about what would be at the far end if I walked just a little farther in. Long enough that the part of me still trying to act like a guard on a shift got quieter, and the part of me that needed to know got louder. That was the real danger in that hallway. Not that it looked impossible, that it looked finished enough to invite explanation. It made you want to take one more step and let the next thing make sense too. I didn't do it. Not then. But I came too close. The thing that finally broke the spell wasn't movement. It was the memory of Philip telling me not to stand there looking. Not, don't enter, not run, not call it in. Don't stand there looking. At the time that had sounded almost stupid in how specific it was. Standing there with my hand still on the bar and that hallway laid out in front of me, it sounded exact. I backed out slowly. Not because I thought moving fast would wake something up, just because the rest of me hadn't caught up to my body yet. The door came back toward me, and for 1 second, the edge of the finished hall narrowed down to a strip of clean light between the frame and the slab wall. Then, it was gone. I stayed on my side of the door after that, breathing through my mouth because I didn't like the air in my nose anymore. Nothing had chased me out. Nothing had even shown itself clearly. That almost would have been easier to live with. What I had instead was worse in a quieter way. I had a whole night of strange details that no longer looked separate. They looked connected, not by a ghost story, not by some clean answer with a name and a set of rules you could write on paper and be done with, just by one awful piece of survival logic. That was when I understood the rules weren't there to protect the building from me. They were there to keep the building from getting hold of me. Once I backed away from that door, the whole rest of the night turned into one thing. Not a fight. Not some big scene where I figured anything out and took control. It was smaller than that. Meaner, too. Just a long stretch of me understanding finally that the rules weren't weird habits from an old night guard. They were the only reason a person could move through that building and still leave it as himself. I didn't go through that door. That mattered. I turned away from it and started back down, keeping my flashlight low and my breathing as even as I could. I used the safer stairwell again at first, but once I hit the lower levels, the sight stopped giving me the clean path out. A door I knew I'd already checked stood open again where it should have been shut. A corridor that should have taken me back toward the front felt longer than it had any right to. Somewhere off to my left, deeper in the building, I heard that same careful work still going, not loud, not rushed, just steady enough to make the whole place feel occupied. I kept moving. That was the pattern by then. Don't stop. Don't stand there trying to solve it. Don't let the building pull you into its pace. When I cut back across one of the lower floors, I saw another work light burning where no one should have still been. It was set low beside a framed wall, angled into a section of conduit and open studs like somebody had just stepped away. That one almost got me more than the hallway had. Not because it was bigger, because it was familiar now. The same wrong detail, waiting in a different place. I didn't touch it. I didn't even slow down much. I looked once, long enough to know what it was, then kept going. That was the first time all night I followed one of Philip's rules without arguing with it in my head. I didn't need to understand the light anymore. I understood what it meant for me if I treated it like a normal thing. That should have made the rest easier. It didn't. I ended up near the west side again because the building kept bending me back that way. Not physically. Not like walls were moving. It was worse than that. Every route that should have taken me cleanly toward the front kept offering me one more turn, one more cut through, one more reason to save a minute by taking the wrong side of the floor. I caught myself doing it twice before I stopped pretending it was an accident. The west stairwell door stood there half in shadow, just another dark rectangle in raw concrete, and I hated how badly a part of me wanted to prove I could walk through it now that I knew what it was. I didn't. I knew better by then. But I still had to pass it, and passing it was enough. Something moved in the edge of my vision before I was even fully level with the door. Same height as a person, same wrong way of not matching the light. It was only there for a second, if that. My body reacted before my mind did. My shoulders tightened, my head almost turned. I stopped that just in time, not because I was calm, because I was scared enough now to listen. I kept my eyes where they needed to be and moved past it. Every instinct I had wanted to check, to make sure, to confirm I wasn't just letting shadows own me. But that was the whole trap, and I knew it now. The building didn't need me to believe in it. It just needed me to react to it like it was mine to understand. So I didn't. I made it past the stairwell and back toward the lower floor corridor, and for one stupid second I thought that was it. I thought maybe once you understood the rules, the place lost some of its reach. Then the radio clipped on my belt cracked to life. It didn't even say my name right away, just that dry burst of static first. Then, the voice. Not loud, not distorted enough to dismiss. It sounded like Philip. I was near the material bay again by then, close enough that my stomach dropped before the words even finished coming through. I had the radio halfway to my mouth when I caught the opening to that space out of the corner of my eye. I stopped. That was enough. Enough for the rule to come back, enough for me to know exactly what the building was asking for. If you're in the material bay, and his voice asks if you're in there, Don't answer from inside. I wasn't deep in it that time, just close enough counted. So I got clear of that section first. 2 steps, 3. Then I keyed the radio from the open corridor and heard nothing but dead air. No follow-up, no correction, nothing. Like whatever had reached for me there had already gotten what it wanted, or failed to. Either way, I was done pretending the radio belonged to me. By that point, all I wanted was morning. Not answers, not pride, not a story I could tell later where I came out looking tougher than I was. I just wanted daylight on the concrete. I wanted traffic sounds that made sense. I wanted the building to go back to looking unfinished in the ordinary way. I finished the shift by shrinking it down. 10 more minutes, 1 more round, 1 more entry in the logbook. Don't cut corners, don't stand still too long. Don't let your eyes wander where they don't need to go. Don't answer too fast. Don't touch what looks set out waiting. Don't trust the shape of a place just because you've already walked it once. That was how I made it to sunrise. No victory in it, no last-minute reversal. Just survival by paying attention and obeying rules I should have stopped mocking hours earlier. By the time the sky started thinning over the city and the sight lost that sealed-off feeling it had carried all night, I was already empty. Not calm, just used up. The lower floors went back to looking like a build again, ugly, dusty, half-done, normal in the ways that count. Even then, I didn't trust it, not all the way. I don't think I ever will. Henry showed up a little after that, moving with the slow stiffness of a man starting too early. He looked at me, then at the logbook, then at the building. "You coming back tonight?" Henry asked. I looked at the building before I answered. "No," I said. That was all. I set the radio down and left the key beside it. I didn't explain. I didn't tell him about the hallway above 8 or the voice in the material bay, or the work lights left burning like placeholders for people who weren't supposed to be there. Maybe he already knew enough. Maybe he didn't. Either way, I wasn't staying long enough to find out. I walked out through the gate with the sun just starting to hit the higher parts of downtown, and the whole place looked smaller from the street than it had from inside the fence. From the outside, it probably looked like I'd done what I always did. Took the job. Lasted 1 night, left. The difference was, this time I wasn't leaving because the work was too much or because I needed an excuse. I left because I finally understood there are places you don't get anything for staying in. By the time I hit the street, I already knew I'd never walk into an unfinished stairwell the same way again. Raw concrete stairs, half-built hallways, radios crackling in empty places, work lights burning where no crew should still be. All of it stayed with me. It still does. Even now, if an intercom pops alive in a building that isn't fully occupied yet, I check where I'm standing before I answer it. When I looked back, I thought I saw a work light come on somewhere high above me. I kept walking.